Warcries are getting a lick of paint in 3.25, and one of the major changes here is that the stats provided by each of the Warcry buffs are being changed to provide something else entirely. In some ways, these are nerfs to existing builds, but they also open up a lot of new options for use in new builds, which is exciting. Let's first take a look at those buff changes. Ancestral Cry will no longer grant bonus flat armor as part of its buff, but it will instead provide elemental resistances and maximum elemental resistances. You'll gain plus 5% to all elemental resistances and plus 1% to all maximum elemental resistances per 10 power, up to a maximum of 30 power. And if you've never interacted with Warcries, you may not know about Warcry Power, which is a system that counts the power of nearby targets, usually just enemies, and adds power based on their rarity. Normal monsters count as 1 power, magic as 2 power, rare as 10 power, and uniques as 20 power. So with 30 power, Ancestral Cry would grant you 15% to all elemental resistances, and more importantly, plus 3% to all maximum elemental resistances. And the Warcry buff durations are also being normalized in patch 3.25 to all be 3.4 seconds base duration at level 20. Next we have Battle Mage's Cry, and this one was a pretty heavy nerf to strength sacking builds because the buff no longer grants attack damage based on spell damage. Instead, it will now provide base additional critical strike chance, plus 0.5% per 5 power up to a maximum of 25 power. So at 25 power you'll be gaining plus 2.5% to critical strike chance while you have this buff. And keep in mind that this is additional base crit, which is added to your weapon's crit chance or your spell's base crit chance, and then is scaled by modifiers to increased critical strike chance. Enduring Cry no longer provides the short burst of life regeneration or the buff which grants additional physical damage reduction based on endurance charges, Rip the Quinn build. It will now grant 2% life regenerated per second per 5 power, up to 25 power for a total of 10% life regen at 25 power. Enduring Cry does still grant endurance charges based on power 2. Next we have Infernal Cry, which no longer covers enemies in Ash. It will instead provide a buff which will grant physical damage as extra fire damage, 5% per 5 power, up to a maximum of 25 power. So 25% of physical damage as extra fire damage at 25 power. And then there's Intimidating Cry, which no longer has Overwhelm as part of its buff. Buff will now instead grant 3% increased movement speed per 5 power, up to a maximum of 30 power, so 18% increased movement speed at 30 power. And there's Rallying Cry, which is one of the only Warcries that doesn't buff the user. The buff provided to allies is changing slightly. It will now grant 3% of your weapon damage as added attack damage to nearby allies per 5 power, up to a maximum of 30, so at 30 power you'd be providing 18% of your weapon's damage to nearby allies as added attack damage. But this one no longer has a hard cap on this stat, which was previously capped at 20%, which is important for the implications of Warcry Buff Effect, which we'll get to in a moment. Seismic Cry no longer makes it easier to stun enemies with its buff. Instead, it now grants 5% more armor and 15% increased stun threshold per 5 power, up to 25 power. So at 25 power you'd be gaining 25% more armor and 75% increased stun threshold. That one is kind of crazy. Alright, some of those new buffs are really powerful, but that's not the full extent of the changes because GDG have also overhauled a bunch of the Warcry wheels on the passive skill tree and added some new ones too. And this is where things start to get a little bit crazy when it comes to these Warcry buffs. Previously, Warcry Buff Effect was a stat that was quite hard to come by. The passive skill tree in 3.24 had just 41% of this stat available, while access to it elsewhere mostly consisted of unique items, such as Mute Wind Pennant or the modifier from the elevated Warlord influenced helmets. But in patch 3.25 you can get a lot more of this stat from just the passive skill tree alone. A new cluster has been added at the Resolute Technique keystone, as the Thunder, which provides a total of 30% increased Warcry Buff Effect for 3 points. The Natural Authority wheel located at the Call to Arms keystone has a total of 45% increased buff effect for 4 points. And then there's a further 20% increased Warcry Buff Effect obtainable from the small nose on the new Roaring Challenge wheel located near the Crimson Dance keystone. So that's a total of 95% increased Warcry Buff Effect obtainable from the passive skill tree. But it doesn't stop there, because GGG are also making that stat a little bit more accessible to the average build by changing Corel's signature Betrayal modifier on helmets from providing physical damage taken as fire into increased Warcry Buff Effect instead. We don't know the numbers on this one just yet, but I'd guess it's going to be somewhere in the region of 15%. So let's just say you're able to obtain a total of 100% increased Warcry Buff Effect. This is where those buffs start to become a little bit ridiculous. With maximum power and 100% increased Warcry Buff Effect, here's what those Warcry buffs would now provide. Ancestral Cry would grant 30% to all elemental resistances, and plus 6% to maximum elemental resistances. Battle Mage's Cry would provide plus 5% to base critical strike chance. Enduring Cry's buff would regenerate 20% of life per second. Infernal Cry would grant 50% of physical damage as extra fire damage. That's the equivalent of 2.5 Herald of Ash buffs. Intimidating Cry would provide 36% increased movement speed, that's just another pair of boots. Rallying Cry, which was previously hard capped, would grant 36% of your weapon's damage to nearby allies as added attack damage. And lastly, Seismic Cry, which is probably the most ridiculous of all of them. This one would grant 50% more armor and 150% increased stun threshold. That is wild. But there's two problems. One being that these are short duration buffs. How do you keep them up with permanent uptime? And two, there's the question of how much power you'll gain on a per use basis, and thus how powerful the effects of these buffs will be. You want to consistently be hitting that maximum power after all. Let's discuss uptime first. In 3.25, Warcry buffs all have a base duration of 3.4 seconds at level 20, which for some of them is a lot shorter than they previously were. But just like the buff effect stat, access to increased Warcry duration on the passive tree has been vastly improved. And you may be surprised to find out that most of it is found in the same location as the increased buff effect, with some even being on the same node. Along with its buff effect, As the Thunder also grants 40% increased Warcry duration, which is incredible value for 3 points spent. Meanwhile, the Escalation Notable, which shares the same wheel as Natural Authority, has a total of 40% increased Warcry duration as well on the small nodes leading up to it. And since you'll already be allocating the access point to reach the buff effect, this is only an extra 2 points spent. The Roaring Challenge wheel also has 27% increased Warcry duration, and again, if you're already allocating the entrance node for the buff effect, this will be just a single extra point spent. That's a total of 107% increased Warcry duration available for just a handful of extra points spent if you're already going for all of the buff effect on the tree, which would bring the duration of all of those Warcry buffs up to just over 7 seconds each. All of the Warcries we've discussed in this video have a cooldown of 8 seconds, but they also have a very strong quality stat, cooldown recovery rate, which scales up to 40% increased cooldown recovery rate at 20% quality. That brings the 8-second cooldown down to just 5.75 seconds, which means you'll technically already have permanent uptime on those buffs. However, Warcries have a significant cast time at 0.8 seconds, so you'll want to invest into some Warcry speed to make the playstyle a bit more comfortable. Pretty much every Warcry build will want to be taking the Admonisher wheel located near the Unwavering Stance keystone, which is a 3-point wheel providing a total of 80% increased Warcry speed, massively improving the cast time of your Warcries from 0.8 seconds down to just over 0.4 seconds. And of course, there are other options that you can consider too for maintaining permanent uptime on Warcry buffs. You can invest into skill effect duration on the tree. Those wheels are located in the middle of the tree near the Scion Star location. And there's also the more duration support, which is being changed from increased duration support in 3.25. A level 20 more duration support with 20% quality will provide 49% more duration, which is really strong. That would grant a further 3.5 seconds duration to the setup mentioned earlier. Okay, so you've got these powerful Warcry buffs, you've solved permanent uptime. What about the problem of Warcry power? How can you ensure that you gain the strongest version of these buffs every time? Well, there's two ways to do this now. Previously there was just one, Red Blade Banner, a unique shield which grants the stat, Warcries have infinite power. This makes Warcries that you use always have the maximum power for anything associated with power scaling, such as the buffs that they provide. But this means you're using your shield slot to equip Red Blade Banner, and it also means that you can't use two-handed weapons as well. But there's another option as of patch 3.25, because the Chieftain received some big changes, including a new ascendancy notable, Sione Sun's Roar, which also grants the modifier Warcries have infinite power, but also just has 30% increased Warcry Buff Effect for even stronger buffs than the ones mentioned before. By using a Chieftain with this notable, you'll have complete freedom in terms of gearing, and you'll also have incredibly strong Warcry buffs which you can maintain all of the time. One thing that should be mentioned here at the end of this video is skill costs. Warcries are quite expensive. They cost 19 mana at level 20, that's before any kind of support gems you may be using such as Second Wind, Urgent Orders or more duration, so they can end up costing a lot of mana. You could try to solve this with Elrion modifiers on jewelry, but a lot of players have been looking at the Blood Magic keystone in these sorts of builds, because with the armor scaling you'll be gaining from Seismic Cry, you can potentially forego using Determination, which means you could consider using Blood Magic and then having your Eternal Blessing aura as an offensive option, such as Pride. And that's it. Warcry buff scaling in 3.25 is looking really powerful. What are your thoughts on those buffs? Do let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and thank you for your ongoing support. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.